This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. What I'm looking at today is 2021's Antlers, directed by Scott Cooper and produced by Guillermo del Toro. Antlers was released in 2001 at the same time and under the same conditions as Dune and One Night in Soho, in fact. The pandemic wasn't at its peak, but it hadn't lessened either. So this movie, I thought, just vanished and just went under the radar. That's not quite true. It earned somewhere in the ballpark of $35,000 worldwide. And considering the fact this movie cost somewhere in the ballpark of $15 to $20 million to produce, it did decently. It didn't do great by any stretch of the imagination. Though it did fine, it performed well. And when I learned about this movie, it goes without saying, what interested me most was that it was produced by Guillermo del Toro. Having seen it, it is a very good movie, and what I like to call a thinking person's horror film. What do I mean by that? Well, Antlers revolves around the legend of the Wendigo, which, if you've watched the movies of Larry Fessenden, in particular Wendigo, and The Last Winter, that creature plays prominently in his films, and it does so here as well. It takes place in a small town in Oregon, and in this town, the primary means of employment used to be coal mines. As you're probably aware, coal as an energy source, at least in the United States, is going by the wayside. And the people who were employed in that industry oftentimes have no options. So, in this instance, the story begins with a man who has two sons. And what he does is cook meth. Because, as I said, there are not a lot of options to people. And when things are desperate, people do desperate things. The movie establishes early on that the Wendigo is a being, an evil being, a malicious being. And when people are most vulnerable, when they despair, when they fear, is when it takes a hold. And in this movie, this whole town is ripe for this creature to appear. Everyone is undergoing some type of crisis. And that's what's most interesting, I think, about this movie. If this were from anyone but Scott Cooper, who has done at least, I believe, 5 other movies besides Antlers, and all those movies dealt with realistic subjects. Wendigo clearly is not realistic. But as a director couched in the world of the real, the world that we actually live in, his horror movie reflects that. In that the town that these people live in is run down. It's not dead, but you can tell it doesn't have a long lease on life. And it's just in decay. And as I mentioned earlier, the people are feeling despair in one way or another. From the children to the adults, this despair is almost tangible. It's a perfect breeding ground for a creature that feeds on it. So the story revolves around 3 or 4 main people, and their plot threads come together. It revolves around this little boy whose dad is possessed by the Wendigo. He doesn't understand what's going on. I mean, this kid can't be any more than 11 or 12. He doesn't get this. This is beyond his comprehension. All that he knows, his family is ill, and he's seeking to help them. His father, knowing that something was very wrong with him, and also not quite knowing what it was, only understands that he has to isolate himself from his children. He has 2 boys. What the movie doesn't quite explain is that the Wendigo appears almost viral in nature, in the sense that you can be infected by it and yet not be the Wendigo, not be taken over by the Wendigo. And one of the brothers is infected. So he is isolated by his brother with his father. His father never harms his son. And that's an interesting thing too, that's worth mentioning. As I mentioned earlier, this guy was a meth dealer, but at the same time he still loved his sons and tried to do his best by them. As I mentioned, this movie has tons of themes, and the more obvious aspects are only one of them. It's really interesting in that way. So in any case, we meet them. And through the son, who is going to school, he's treating it at business as usual while trying to care for his father and brother, we meet a teacher. This teacher is as damaged in her own way as this little boy. And she's recently moved back to the town. Carrie Russell, in fact, plays the teacher. And she's moved back to the town to live with her brother, played by Jesse Plemons. And he's the sheriff. And there's an underlying tension between them both, because Jesse Plemons' character doesn't understand why his sister left him with his father, though he doesn't overtly react to her, but Carrie Russell's character at least senses that there's something going on here. And she notices the little boy in her class who is a magnet for bullies. Though he's not a pushover, he's not physically imposing, but he stands up as best he can. And so she grows very attached to this little boy, perhaps noticing how damaged he actually appears. Once again, she is as well, just in a different way. So she inserts herself into his life. Now, keep in mind, as I said, this little boy is caring for his father and his little brother, both of whom have been touched by the Wendigo, the father more so than his son. At the end of the day, through the interference of well-meaning people in the community, this entity is released, and it wreaks havoc. But as I said, the monster is only one part of the terror. Another part is communities abandoned when industry leaves them. Another part is a system that seemingly doesn't particularly care about the people it's meant to help. There's so many layers to this movie, which is why I call it a thinking person's horror movie. It's beautifully shot, though a bit dark. Though we're not talking about AVP, Aliens vs. Predator Requiem here. You can see what's happening, though it is typically quite dark, literally and figuratively. And the creature itself seems practical for the most part. You can tell that there are instances of it being CGI, but there oftentimes seems to be an actual creature there as well. And Scott Cooper, the director, treats it almost like the shark in Jaws, which is to say, you never actually see all of it at any one time. Even at the end of the movie, you don't quite see all of it, though what you can see is a little bit terrifying. Horns is refreshing because, as you already know, I watch a lot of horror, and it's nice to see horror that cares more about ideas and themes than gore, though it does have a bit of that. This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com in review. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow. Peace.